My name is Leah Garner. I'm 29 years old. 3 months before my sister's wedding, she called to tell me I wasn't going to be a bridesmaid anymore. Not because we had a fight. Not because I said something wrong at the engagement party. Because her fiancé's family had certain expectations about how the wedding party should look. And apparently, an electrician didn't fit the picture. She said it carefully. The way you say something you've been rehearsing. She said Derek's mother was very traditional. She said the Walsh family moved in particular circles. She said she still wanted me there, of course, just not standing at the altar in a matching dress where everyone could see. I asked her what that meant, exactly. She hesitated. She said Derek's father had invited some very important people. Investors, business contacts, people from the architectural community. She said Derek just wanted everything to feel consistent, polished. I said, "What does that have to do with me?" She said, "Honey, you know how it is. You show up to jobs in a work van. You wear steel-toed boots. Derek's family is going to ask what everyone does for a living, and he just doesn't want to have to explain." I sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, I could see my neighbor's dog sleeping in the yard. I said, "You mean he doesn't want to explain that his future sister-in-law is an electrician?" She didn't say no. I said, "Okay." She exhaled, relief flooding her voice like I'd just done her a tremendous favor. She said I was so mature about everything, that she knew I'd understand, that we'd still have so much fun at the reception. She'd make sure I had a great seat. I said, "Sure." We said goodbye. I hung up. I stood there in my kitchen, in work pants and a thermal shirt, coffee going cold on the counter, and I thought about all the Sunday dinners where this had been quietly building into something neither of us ever said out loud. The pattern started when I was 22. I was a semester into a business degree at Tennessee State, sitting at my parents' kitchen table in Brentwood, and I told them I was dropping out. Not because I was failing. Not because I couldn't handle the coursework. Because I'd spent the summer working with a residential electrician named Dennis who was paying me $16 an hour to run wire and pull permits and learn how systems actually worked. And somewhere around August I realized I would rather do that every day for the rest of my life than sit in another marketing lecture. My mother set down her fork. My father looked at me the way he looked at things he didn't understand, which was with a kind of careful, patient disappointment. My sister, who was 25 at the time, and already working as a paralegal at a downtown firm, said, "So you're going to be an electrician?" I said, "I'm going to get my license and eventually run my own company." Nobody said that's interesting. Nobody said, "Tell me more." My mother said something about a woman she knew whose nephew had done trade school and was doing fine. The word fine doing a lot of work in that sentence. My father said trades were honest work, which somehow managed to be both a compliment and a dismissal at the same time. My sister went back to her salad. The conversation moved on. Over the next 7 years, I watched how they talked to my sister versus how they talked to me at those Sunday dinners. She made junior associate. They asked her which partners she was working with, what kind of cases, whether she'd been to any good work events. When she got promoted, my mother cried actual tears of pride at the table. When I passed my journeyman's exam at 24, I told them at Sunday dinner. My father said, "That's great, kiddo," and asked my sister if she'd heard back about her bar membership renewal. When I got my master electrician's license at 26, the highest certification available in the state of Tennessee, I mentioned it while passing the breadbasket. My mother said, "What does that mean exactly?" I explained it meant I could now legally supervise all electrical work on any job in the state, sign off on inspections, run projects independently. She nodded and said, "Well, that sounds useful." When I started GarnerVolt Electric at 27, just me and 2 guys I trusted from jobs I'd worked, a used van, a business license, and a website I built myself at 1 in the morning, I told them at Sunday dinner. My father said small businesses were a risk. My mother said she hoped I was keeping an emergency fund. My sister asked if I needed her to look over any contracts. That was it. We moved on to dessert. I stopped expecting different after that. I kept the Sunday dinners because I loved my family, in the complicated way you love people who have never quite seen you clearly. But I stopped trying to show them what I was building. I showed up, I answered when they asked how work was, and I moved on. What they didn't know, because they never asked, was what GarnerVolt had become by the time my sister called to uninvite me from her wedding party. In year 1, I took every job I could get. Residential panel upgrades, outlet installations, ceiling fade replacements. The kind of work most electricians don't want, because the margins are thin and the clients are difficult. I took it anyway, because I needed the reviews and the referrals and the practice of running a job from start to finish without anyone above me to catch my mistakes. By the end of year 2, I had 4 employees and a truck that didn't smell like someone else's cigarettes. We'd moved into light commercial work, restaurant build-outs, small office renovations, a brewery in East Nashville that referred us to 3 more breweries. Year 3 was when things changed. I landed a contract with a property management company that owned 47 buildings across Middle Tennessee. Routine electrical maintenance, emergency service calls, code upgrades. Steady, predictable work that let me plan. I hired 2 more electricians. I hired a part-time office manager named Sandra, who was 61 and terrifying, and the best thing that ever happened to my business. Year 4, I got my first major commercial contract. New construction, a mixed-use development in the Gulch, full electrical scope, $380,000. I almost didn't bid it because the number scared me. Sandra told me to stop being foolish and submit the proposal. We got it. We delivered on time and passed every inspection first try. By year 5, when my sister called me 3 months before her wedding to explain that my existence would be an embarrassment to her in-laws, GarnerVolt Electric had 11 employees, a real office with a conference room, and was on track to close the year at $2.4 million in revenue. I personally cleared $210,000. My sister made $87,000 as a paralegal at a mid-size firm. Neither of those numbers came up in the conversation, because she didn't ask, and I had learned a long time ago that telling them without being asked felt like begging. So I said okay. I said sure, and I hung up the phone and went back to work. The wedding was on a Saturday in October, out at a venue called the Harlow Estate in Franklin, Tennessee, 45 minutes south of Nashville. The kind of place with white fences and rolling hills and a barn that wasn't actually a barn, just a building designed to look like one, with Edison bulbs and a catering kitchen. I drove myself. I wore the one dress I owned, that wasn't business casual, deep green with long sleeves, heels I'd borrowed from a friend because I couldn't justify buying a new pair for an event where I'd been demoted from the wedding party. I did my own hair. I pulled into the parking lot at 4:15, 15 minutes before the ceremony. The gravel crunched under my tires. I sat in my car for a moment, engine off, watching guests in cocktail attire drift toward the ceremony space. A woman in a blush dress laughed at something near the entrance. 2 men in suits shook hands by the fountain. I thought about leaving. I thought about it seriously. The way you think about something you know you won't do but want to feel the possibility of, for a moment. Then I got out of the car. The ceremony was beautiful, and I mean that genuinely. My sister looked stunning. Derek cried when she walked down the aisle, which surprised me because I'd found him difficult to read in the 2 years they'd been together. The vows were personal and specific, and you could tell they'd written them themselves. I sat in the 3rd row from the back and watched my sister marry someone who loved her, and I was glad for her even while something small and tight lived in my chest the whole time. Cocktail hour was in the garden, strung lights overhead, servers with champagne on silver trays. I got a glass and found a quiet spot near the hedgerow and talked to my Aunt Renee, who is 70 and doesn't care about anyone's job title, and told me 3 times that my hair looked beautiful. It was the most comfortable I felt all evening. My table at dinner was number 18. There were 22 tables. I found my place card, sat down, introduced myself to the strangers around me. A college friend of Derek's from Vanderbilt, his girlfriend, an older couple who were neighbors of the Walsh family. The kind of table you put people at when you need to seat them somewhere and you're not sure where else to put them. The food was good. The speeches were funny. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I was watching the dance floor from table 18 when someone appeared at my right shoulder. A man, late 60s, silver hair, built like someone who'd done physical work for most of his life and never quite lost the posture. He was looking at my place card. He said, "Garner." "Leah Garner." I said yes. He said, "GarnerVolt Electric?" I set my glass down and looked at him properly. I said, "That's right." He exhaled, slow and satisfied, the way people exhale when something finally makes sense. He said his name was Robert Walsh, Derek's father. He said he'd been trying to put a face to that name for 6 months. I knew who he was. The Walsh Group had been on my books since April. A boutique hotel development in Midtown Nashville, 18 months of construction, a full electrical scope that my crew had been brought onto midway through after the original electrical contractor walked off the job. Messy situation. Code violations, failed inspections, a project timeline in serious trouble. I didn't know Robert Walsh had a son named Derek until right now. He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down without asking, which I appreciated somehow. He said his project manager had told him about us, that GarnerVolt had come in on 9 days' notice and recertified the entire electrical system on the Midtown project, that we'd coordinated directly with the city inspector's office, resolved 14 open violations, and kept the construction schedule from collapsing entirely. He said, "Do you know what that project was worth to us?" I said I had some idea. He said the original contractor's failures had put them at risk of $2.3 million in penalties and timeline damages, that we had prevented that. That in 30 years of development work, he had never seen a crew come in under that kind of pressure and perform the way my crew had performed. He was not a man who gave compliments lightly. I could tell by the way he delivered them. I said, "My crew is exceptional." I said, "Miguel and Devin and the rest of them work at a level I've never seen anywhere else." I said, "The real credit goes to them." He said, "You're the one who took the call at 6 in the morning and said yes when everyone else said it was impossible." I said, "I knew we could do it." He smiled. He said, "I know. That's the difference." We talked for 20 minutes about the Midtown project, about the city inspection process, about a new development his company was looking at in the Germantown neighborhood that would need an electrical partner from the ground up. He asked about our capacity, our team size, our experience with new construction at scale. He asked the kind of questions that meant he already knew the answers and was checking whether I did too. I didn't notice my sister approaching until she was 3 feet away. She said, "Robert." She said it with the slightly elevated warmth of someone speaking to their new father-in-law at their wedding. She said, "I see you found someone to talk to." He stood when he saw her. He said, "Your sister found me, actually." He said, "Or I found her." He said, "Do you know what this woman's company did for us this spring?" My sister looked at me, then at him, then back at me. She said, "Leah works in electrical." He said, "Leah owns GarnerVolt Electric." He said it the way you say something obvious, the way you state a fact you assume everyone in the room already knows. He said, "She's the reason the Midtown project didn't collapse." My sister's expression went through several things in quick succession. Confusion first, then recognition of something, then a look I couldn't name exactly, something between embarrassment and vertigo, the look of a person realizing the floor is not where they thought it was. She said, "You own it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I thought you just worked there." I said, "I started it." Robert Walsh looked between us with the calm patience of a man who had lived long enough to know when he'd accidentally stepped into something. He excused himself, said he wanted to find his wife, squeezed my hand once, and said they'd talk soon about Germantown. He walked away. My sister and I stood there. The dance floor was 20 feet away. A slow song had started. I could see Derek dancing with his mother, her head on his shoulder. My sister said, "Can we go somewhere and talk?" We found a quiet corner near the side exit, behind the bar setup where the caterers were moving in and out. The October night was cold through the propped-open door. I could smell wood smoke from somewhere. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her. She was still in her wedding dress, the cathedral veil detached now, her lipstick slightly faded from dinner. She looked genuinely confused, and the confusion made me feel something complicated, because it meant she really hadn't known, which meant she had spent all this time dismissing something she hadn't even looked at closely enough to see. I said, "I did tell you. I told you at Sunday dinner when I got my license. I told you when I started the company. I told you when we landed the property management contract and when we finished the Gulch build-out. I said, 'How's work?' And I answered, 'How's work?' And nobody ever asked me anything more specific than that, she said. But I didn't know it was this big. I said, what did you think it was? She didn't answer. I said, you called me 3 months ago and told me I couldn't be in your wedding because your husband's family would have to explain what I do for a living. My job. That job. The one that just saved your father-in-law $2 million. The one that pays me more than twice what you make. The one I built from nothing in 5 years while sitting at Sunday dinners where the word electrician was the end of the conversation and the word paralegal was the beginning of one. Her eyes filled. I said, I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because you never asked. Not once in 5 years did you say, hey, how's the company actually doing? Not mom, not dad. Evan gets promoted, and the whole table stops for 10 minutes to discuss it. I got my master's license, which is the highest electrical certification in the state, and you said that sounds useful and asked me to pass the rolls. She put her hand over her mouth. I said, I know you didn't mean it the way it landed. I know you were trying to manage your in-laws and your wedding and 100 other things. But you chose their comfort over my dignity. And you did it without even knowing what you were asking me to be invisible about. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. She said, I'm so sorry, Leah. I believed her. I also knew that sorry, in that moment, was the beginning of something, and not the end of it. I told her so. I said, we can talk more, after tonight. When it's not your wedding and you're not in a dress. I said, I love you, and I'm glad you married someone who cries at your vows. I said, let's not do this tonight. She nodded, wiped her eyes carefully so she didn't ruin her makeup. She reached for my hand. I let her take it. Derek found us a few minutes later. He looked like a man who'd been pulled aside by his father and given information he wasn't prepared for. He said my name carefully, like he was feeling out the shape of it. He said his father had told him about the Midtown project. I said, I know. He said, I didn't know it was your company. I said, no one did. He said, I owe you an apology. For the wedding party situation. I was thinking about optics, about my family, and I was wrong. I looked at him for a moment. He was 34, tall, genuinely handsome in the way architects sometimes were. Like they'd arranged their features with intention. He seemed like a decent person, trying to say the right thing. I said, I appreciate that. He said, I mean it. I said, I believe you. I said, take care of my sister. I said, your father is a good man. He shook my hand, formal and sincere, and went back to his wedding. I found my Aunt Renee on the dance floor and danced with her for 2 songs, and the tight thing in my chest loosened by degrees. My mother found me at the bar around 9:30. She looked the way she always looked at family events, dressed carefully, hair done, a little outside her comfort zone, but managing it with practiced composure. She was 61. She'd worked as a dental office manager for 23 years. She'd wanted her daughters to be something she could describe easily at parties, something that came with a clear job title and a understood social position. She said, I heard what Robert Walsh said to you. I said yes. She said, I didn't know the company was that size. I said, I know, Mom. She said, I don't understand why you never said anything. I turned to face her. I said things. I told you every step. You asked how work was, and I said fine because that was the only answer anyone waited around for. When I said anything more than fine, you said that's great, honey, and moved on. I stopped bringing it up because it was easier than watching you treat my life like a box to check before getting to the conversation you actually wanted to have. She was quiet. I said, you're proud of Claire's career because you understand it. Law is respectable. It maps onto things you know. You couldn't picture what I do, so you decided it wasn't worth picturing. And I let you, because fighting it was exhausting, and I had a company to build. She said, I was afraid for you. I said, I know, she said. When you dropped out, I thought you were making a mistake. I thought trade work was something people did when they couldn't do other things. I thought you were selling yourself short. I said, I know you thought that. She said, I was wrong. I said, yes. She said, are you going to let me try to fix it? I looked at her for a long moment. At the lines around her eyes, the way she held her champagne glass with both hands like she needed something to anchor her. She was not a cruel woman. She had never been cruel. She had been afraid and limited, and she had let that shape how she saw me in ways that cost me more than she understood. I said, yes. I said, I want that. But things have to be different, she said. Tell me what different looks like. I said, ask me about work the way you ask Claire, not as a formality. Not how's work the way you'd ask a stranger about the weather. Actually ask. What are you working on? How's your crew? What's the hardest thing you're dealing with right now? Treat my company like it exists. She nodded. I said, and don't apologize to me at parties about what I do. Don't explain me to people. If someone asks what your daughter does, you say she owns an electrical contracting company in Nashville. You say it like it's the obvious thing, because it is. She said, okay. I said, that's it. That's what different looks like. She said, I can do that. I said, I know you can. She hugged me. I let her, and held on a little longer than I usually did. My father found me outside near the parking lot an hour later. He'd loosened his tie. He'd been at the open bar long enough to be honest. He said, your mother told me. I said, I figured. He said, I looked up GarnerVolt on my phone just now. I said, and? He said, you have 4.9 stars on Google. 112 reviews. He said, one of them says best electrical company in Tennessee. Full stop. I said, that was from a hotel client. He said, the Walsh Group Hotel. I said yes. He said, your sister had no idea. I said no. He was quiet for a moment. He was 63, stocky. A man who'd worked in supply chain logistics for 30 years and had strong opinions about the right way to do physical work, even though he'd spent most of his career behind a desk. He had always respected labor more than my mother did. He'd just never thought to look closely enough at mine to see it clearly. He said, I should have asked more questions. I said, yeah. He said, I didn't ask because I think I was afraid you'd tell me something I didn't know how to respond to. Something that would make me feel like I'd failed you. I said, that's honest. He said, did I fail you? I thought about it. The real answer was complicated. I said, you didn't see me. That's not the same as failing. But it's not nothing either. He nodded. I said, I needed you to be curious about what I was building. Not impressed, just curious. You were proud of Claire because you followed her career. You knew her wins because you asked about them. You never gave mine the same attention, and after a while I stopped expecting it. He said, I'm sorry, Leah. I said, I know, Dad. He said, I'd like to come see the Midtown project before it opens, if that's allowed. I said I'd set it up. He put his arm around my shoulders for a moment, briefly, the way he'd done when I was a kid. Then he went back inside. I stood in the parking lot for a while. The October air was sharp, the kind of cold that makes everything feel more real. I could hear music from inside, something with a good beat, people laughing. 3 days later, I was at the office, reviewing permit applications for the Germantown project, which Robert Walsh had formally requested we bid on at a scope of $620,000, when my sister called. She said, Are you at work? I said yes. She said, What are you working on? I paused. I said, A bid for a new development in Germantown. Electrical scope on a new build. She said, Is that a big one? I said, It's the biggest bid we've ever submitted. She said, Can I ask what the number is? I told her. She was quiet. Then she said, Leah, that's incredible. I said, I know. She said, I've been thinking all week about what you said, about Sunday dinners, about how I never asked. I said, I know. She said, I want to start asking. I said, then ask. She asked. She asked for 45 minutes. She asked about the company structure, about how I'd gotten the master electrician's license, about what my crew was like, about what the hardest project we'd ever taken on was. She asked the way you ask when you're genuinely trying to fill in 5 years of missing information. I answered everything. At the end, she said, I'm proud of you. She said, I know I don't have the right to be proud of something I wasn't paying attention to, but I am. I said, "You have the right. You're my sister." She said, "I'm going to do better." I said, "I know you are." The Germantown project bid went in on a Thursday. Robert Walsh called me personally on the following Monday to say they'd chosen GarnerVolt. I told Sandra first, she said, obviously, and went back to her spreadsheet. I called my father. He said, "Tell me everything." I told him. He listened to all of it. At the next Sunday dinner, my mother asked me what we were working on. Not how's work, what are we working on? I told her about Germantown, about the scope, about the timeline, about the apprentice I'd just hired, who was 20 years old, and the best rough wire technician I'd seen since Miguel. She asked questions I didn't expect her to know to ask. She'd done research. I could tell by the specificity of the words. My father pulled out his phone halfway through and showed me that he'd bookmarked the GarnerVolt website. My sister texted me that week to say she'd told her firm's managing partner about us, that he owned 3 commercial buildings in Nashville and had been looking for a reliable electrical contractor. She asked if it was okay if she gave him my number. I said yes. He called the following Thursday. I didn't change who I was. I showed up to the Sunday dinners in whatever I'd worn to the job site that day, because I always had, and nobody said a word about it. I talked about projects and permits, and the headache of coordinating with HVAC contractors who thought they owned the ceiling grid. My family listened. They asked follow-up questions. It wasn't perfect. My mother sometimes still framed things in ways that revealed how recently she'd started paying attention, and my father occasionally said things that made clear he still pictured my work as smaller than it was. But they were trying. That's different from what it was. My sister and I had dinner alone in December. A real dinner. Just the 2 of us at a Thai place in Hillsborough Village. We talked for 3 hours. About the wedding. About the years before it. About the things we'd both been carrying without telling each other. She said she'd spent so long measuring success by what Derek's family would recognize that she'd stopped looking at what was actually in front of her. I said I understood that. I said I'd spent so long building in silence that I hadn't noticed how much of the silence I'd chosen. She paid the check. I let her. In March, 7 months after the wedding, my crew broke ground on the Germantown project. I drove to the site on the first morning, parked my van on the street, and watched the excavators work for a few minutes before pulling on my hard hat. My father was standing next to me. He'd asked if he could come. I'd said yes. He'd been there since 7:15, earlier than I'd arrived, standing in work boots he'd dug out of his garage that he'd worn 30 years ago and apparently still had. He said, "So this is yours." I said, "This is ours. Mine and the crew's." He said, "Tell me what happens first." So I told him. I told him about the rough-in schedule, about the service entrance, about coordinating with the plumbers on the lower levels, about the inspection milestones we'd need to hit to keep the construction schedule on track. He listened the way he listened to my sister talk about litigation. Like it mattered. Like the details were worth following. At 9 o'clock, Miguel pulled up in his truck. He got out, saw my father, extended his hand. He said, "You're Leah's dad." He said, "Your daughter runs the best crew in Nashville." My father shook his hand. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I put on my hard hat, picked up my clipboard, and went to work. The sky that morning was clear and cold, the kind of blue that only shows up in early spring before everything goes soft. The site smelled like diesel and fresh dirt and possibility. My crew moved with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. I used to think success was something you achieved and then announced. I used to think the point was to make the people who doubted you see that they were wrong. I spent 5 years building a company in the hope that eventually the numbers would be undeniable, the awards would be visible, the proof would be too loud to ignore. But standing on that job site in March, watching my father watch my crew work, I understood that the proof was never really the point. The point was the work. The work was always the point. They didn't ask, and so they didn't know. Now they ask. Now they know. It took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it should have, and I'm not pretending the years before the wedding didn't happen. But they're trying, and I'm still building. Both things are true, and both things are enough.